Well, our book is about the way in which the two major parties in the United States are different kinds of parties. And our central argument is that the Republican Party is really an ideological party. The vast majority of Republicans identify as conservatives. They view their party's purpose as advancing conservative values. Whereas the Democratic Party is really a social group coalition where most Democrats are attracted to their party through various forms of social identity or sympathy, and they view the purpose of their party as advancing the interests of the particular constituent groups within the party. And so to understand American politics, you really have to acknowledge the fact that the two parties operate very differently, think of themselves very differently, and have different kinds of objectives once they're in office. And we came to this argument over a period of time. I think both my co-author, Matt Grossman, and I had thought a lot about the ways in which the parties were different in different specific domains in Congress, in the electorate. But we started to put it all together a few years ago during the rise of the Tea Party movement after Barack Obama was elected to the presidency. And we saw this fairly remarkable response, not only among Republican voters, but also among Republican elected officials, that not only challenged the Democrats and sort of constituted very fervent opposition to Obama and Obama's allies in Congress, but also there was this sort of internecine warfare within the Republican Party that happened around that same time, and where Republicans were attacking other Republicans for not being conservative enough, not being true enough to conservative principles, not being strong enough opponents of the liberal opposition. And so Matt and I kind of thought that this wasn't a phenomenon that existing theories of parties really accounted for very well. And it also struck us that there really was no equivalent to the Tea Party in the Democratic Party or on the left. Even when George W. Bush was president, there wasn't this sort of mass populist rejection of the Democratic Party's leadership based on perceived insufficient ideological fidelity. So it really got us to thinking about the ways in which the Republican Party really is kind of a different animal than the Democrats are, and operates in a different way even when they're kind of in the same situation. And so that inspired us to start to put the kind of puzzle pieces together to make the argument that we lay out in the book. So this is a book that covers American political parties, and there isn't much about American politics that doesn't have a partisan component to it or isn't dominated by partisanship. So when you're writing a book about parties, you're really writing a book about voters, about activists, about interest groups, about the news media, about Congress, about presidents, about the bureaucracy, about campaigns. And so we sort of had to cover all of these different specific subject domains and to explain how it is that our argument applied in all these different areas. And that required an awful lot of research, and it required an awful lot of sort of methodological pluralism about addressing the different evidence that existed in these different domains. So when we're talking about voters, for example, a lot of the evidence comes from public opinion surveys. And so there's quantitative analysis of citizens' attitudes and preferences that we analyze and we present in the book to substantiate our argument about how the asymmetry presents itself at the level of the electorate. But then when we go to talking about interest groups and talking about the news media, we have a different set of evidence that comes from, some of it is qualitative evidence from historical narratives, some of it is content analysis of speeches and debates and policy platforms. And so we had to work in a lot of different kinds of data analysis, both quantitative and qualitative, into the book in different chapters in order to cover these various specific subjects and these specific areas of American politics where we see the party asymmetry. And so we tried to make the data analysis accessible to people who were not specialists and not necessarily interested in the methodological details. We tried to work very hard to present the argument and the evidence in an understandable way, while at the same time convincing specialists within our own field that we knew our stuff in terms of the methods and in terms of the presentation of our argument. And so it's a book that covers a lot of different specific areas of American politics and investigates them with a variety of different methodological tools. One of the main implications of having asymmetric politics is it affects the way in which public policy is made in this country. And Americans, and even those of us who study American politics, often don't think very much about the way that the United States is different from otherwise comparable Western democracies. But one of the main differences is that there is an aversion to public sector, large government solutions to social problems in American politics compared to the politics of Western Europe or Canada or other democracies around the world. And in part, that's a function of the fact that there's a very almost a permanent strain in American political culture of suspicion of state power, particularly at the federal level, of government as a threat to individual liberty. And that goes all the way back, of course, in American history. But it's also the case that we have a political system in this country that often requires bipartisan compromise in order for policy to be made. Or at the very least, even if one party is in charge of the presidency and Congress in making policy, they're still very sensitive to the lines of attack that the opposition might be making on the policy that they're trying to pursue. And so what that has resulted in many times in the sort of the policymaking process in this country has been an attempt to solve social problems, especially social problems that Democrats and Democratic constituencies want to see addressed, using the means of policies that are not just government expanding policies. The solution is not just let's add a bureaucracy, let's add a bunch of agencies, let's add a lot of federal money to solve the problem, because even Democrats in our country are very aware of the potency of the Republican ideological attack on big government. So, for example, if you look at the healthcare system in the United States compared to the healthcare system in other countries, it looks very different. And one of the reasons it looks different is that we rely on the private sector to deliver health care and health insurance to a much greater degree than a lot of other countries. And even when the Democrats tried to solve the problem of the uninsured by passing the Affordable Care Act in 2010, if you sort of notice, it relies a lot on private sector actors, and it maintains the existing employer-based insurance system for a lot of Americans. And then for those who are uninsured, it gives them a market competition solution where insurers are competing for the business of consumers, which is a very relatively small government solution to the problem of the uninsured that we don't have, that other countries don't have. So one of the things that we found was the way in which the Republican ideological attack on big government has really shaped a lot of how politics works in this country over a period of decades. And we see the residue of that in the policies that are still in place today. Another big piece of the story that we tell in the book is that the asymmetry we see between the Democratic and Republican parties is not just an accident of history. In fact, it's a fairly rational response to the structure of public opinion in this country. If you look at what voters think about politics collectively in the United States, most Americans are suspicious of big government, are more likely to identify as conservatives rather than liberals, are more likely to believe that the government should do more to promote traditional values than to be in favor of large-scale social or cultural change. But at the same time, on specific issues, like should the government give more money to people for health care, should the government fund education, should the government regulate private insurance companies or corporate polluters, then the American public looks a lot more liberal than conservative. So there's a fundamental ambivalence, or maybe you could say contradiction, in American public opinion between a sort of a conservative-leaning, abstract set of beliefs and a liberal-leaning, concrete set of policy preferences. And so that gives each party a unique set of incentives when it's trying to go and win votes in an election. It tells the Democrats, don't talk about ideology, don't talk about being a liberal or liberal values, talk about the nuts and bolts of the policies that you're in favor of, and attack the Republicans for being against those things. And so Democrats go off on the campaign trail and they say, here's what we're going to do to give you health care or child care. Here's what we're going to do to give you affordable college tuition. Here's what we're going to do to protect particular social groups from discrimination. They talk very specifically and they emphasize specific policy stances. Republicans have the incentive to have a different conversation. They have the incentive to talk in much broader themes about larger values and principles, about conservatism, about American nationalism, and about cultural and moral traditionalism. And that's the playing field that they want elections to be decided on. And so each party is responding rationally to the incentives that the voters themselves are presenting to them in a way that further reinforces the asymmetry that we find. One of the most important developments in American politics over the last few decades has been the declining level of trust that Republican voters in particular have in the traditional sources of information in our society. Those traditional sources are the mainstream news media and the educational system, particularly the higher educational system, academia. And we show this in a series of tables and figures in our book about that there's a big partisan gap that didn't used to exist in the extent to which conservatives and non-conservatives differ in their sources of political information and in the levels of trust that they have in different information-providing institutions in American society. And one of the ways that that has manifested itself has been a preference for openly ideological alternative sources of information on the right, but not on the left. And so if we look at the rise of conservative media sources like Fox News and talk radio and conservative internet, it's satisfying a demand for alternative news sources and information sources that Republicans have. The Democrats don't have that demand. Every once in a while, someone will try to have liberal talk radio or the liberal version of Fox News, and it's never quite as successful because Democrats are relatively satisfied with the usual sources of information, the New York Times, CNN, National Public Radio. So they're not looking for an openly ideological alternative, whereas Republicans are. And similarly, in the world of academia and in the policymaking universe, there's a feeling on the right that the universities are dominated by liberals, that they can't be trusted to give unbiased information, and therefore conservatives need to look to other places such as conservative think tanks for information about policy that they can trust and that they feel is more ideologically congenial. And so if you look at how voters view the news media, there's a big partisan gap. Republicans only trust Fox News, and they don't trust the major other networks. Democrats, it's the opposite. They trust everybody but Fox. And so what this means is that the two parties are more and more operating in different worlds, not only when it comes to their policy preferences and their ideological predispositions, but even in their idea of what the facts are, and even in their respect for traditional sources of expertise. A lot of Republican politicians and Republican activists and Republican voters don't defer to the authority of traditional intellectual experts in the sciences or in the social sciences to the same degree that they did 40 or 50 years ago. And to a large part, that's because of the view that academics are liberals and they're pushing a liberal line, and so therefore they can't be trusted when they're providing information. And we believe that's a very, very important part of the story about the asymmetry in American politics today, is that we have one party that is really building its own alternate informational universe, and another party is still relying on the more traditional sources of information in society. And I think every day we watch American politics, I think we see evidence of that very important imbalance. The 2016 election has been, I think, pretty good for the argument that there's a fair amount of difference between the two major parties. And we see, I think, particularly this year, a growing realization, not just among academics, but among journalists and pundits and attentive citizens, that the two parties are different animals. If you look at what happened with the Democratic Party in the 2016 presidential primaries, you did have a fairly ideological candidate running in Bernie Sanders, whose main line of attack against Hillary Clinton and against the Democratic Party institutionally is that it's just not liberal enough. It's just not true enough to the principles of the politics of the left. And that he was running as a kind of a candidate that would introduce purity and kind of cleanse the party of its cozy relationship with Wall Street, or its preoccupation with appealing to conservative-leaning voters. And that sort of rings true to the extent that we agree, to some extent, with Bernie Sanders. The Democratic Party is not really an ideological party. And we think that observation that he made contains a lot of empirical truth to it, whether or not you agree with his political positions. But of course, the fact that Bernie Sanders didn't win, that Hillary Clinton defeated him, in part because she did a better job of appealing to the major social groups within the Democratic coalition, sort of proves the point that the Democrats are not really as interested in pursuing ideological purity as they are in nominating someone who presents herself as a pragmatist, as someone who is more interested in achieving practical policy gains than in remaining true to a more abstract set of ideals. And so that, I think, was very illustrative of the fact that Democrats are not motivated by ideological commitments the same way that many Republicans are. And then on the Republican side, if you looked at the debates that happened during the Republican primaries, they were very different than the debates that happened in the Democratic primaries. There was much less discussion of policy details, and there was much less discussion about how you actually, in practical terms, achieve your political goals. There was a lot of discussion about symbolic adherence to Republican values, and a lot of discussion about which candidate best represented opposition to the Obama administration, to Hillary Clinton, and to the Democratic Party. And Donald Trump won the nomination in part because he presented himself as sort of the biggest critic of democratic liberalism and the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton. Trump is also noteworthy for his rhetorical emphasis on American nationalism. His campaign has been about making America great again, and that's a very broad symbolic argument. And he doesn't talk a lot about the nuts and bolts of what he was actually going to do and how he's actually going to do it. In the presidency, he talks a lot about the symbolic importance of what his candidacy means and how it's different from the Democratic opposition. And I think another part of the story is the role of the conservative media. And that's another thing that I think people are starting to understand, is that within Republican politics, the conservative media universe and conservative media personalities play a tremendously influential role. They have a lot of power within the party, and the elected officials and traditional leaders of the party have needed to grapple with the fact that they're being challenged, in a sense, for supremacy within the party by a lot of people who are talk radio hosts, who are on television, who have conservative websites, who have the allegiance of a lot of Republican rank-and-file voters. And that a lot of Republican voters are very dissatisfied with the traditional elected leadership of the party for a lot of reasons and are looking for alternatives. And Trump was certainly an alternative to the traditional leadership of the Republican Party. Again, there's really no analog on the Democratic side to the role of conservative media and to even the existence of there really isn't a liberal media universe the way there's a conservative media universe in American politics today. And over time, that conservative media universe has become more and more powerful in party politics. And it seems to us almost impossible to understand American politics and Republican Party politics today without understanding the tremendously central role that ideological media plays in influencing how voters behave and how voters view their Republican leaders. And the Trump nomination in some ways is a fairly powerful piece of evidence of the influence of conservative media over the traditional authorities within the Republican Party. There were surprises that came up as we did the research, one of them being the fact that this asymmetry really has very deep historical roots. We started out really thinking mostly about politics today and wanting to explain politics today and why the parties were different today in both the mass electorate, in government, on the campaign trail, among interest groups, among think tanks and the news media. And we thought we had plenty to say about what was happening today. And some of our friends and people who read our work encouraged us to go back deeper into history and to tell the story of how the parties today came to be and how far back does this asymmetry go. And our initial response was to say, gosh, we think we've already got plenty that we're trying to explain without also adding in a big historical component. But we were we were sort of convinced to do that. And I think it is a valuable part of the story because, again, surprising to us, the asymmetry that we see really is a long-lived historical phenomenon. And if you go back even 100 years and look at what the parties were like in the early 20th century, you still see the Republicans as more ideologically defined and the Democrats as a social group coalition. The precise groups within the social group coalition on the Democratic side have changed a lot, obviously, over time. It used to be a party of Southern whites and Northern Irish immigrants, and it's now much more a party of racial minorities and feminists and religious minorities. But the character of the party as a social group coalition has remained very constant over generations of political history. And the Republicans, likewise, have been mostly true to the sort of conservative ideological nature of their party over that same period. And so that was one of the biggest surprises that we found, and one that we think kind of bolsters our argument that this is not just a fleeting phenomenon, but this is something that's a fairly permanent fixture of American politics. So we think we have something to teach the parties themselves, and we think that the parties would benefit from understanding this asymmetry in a couple of different ways. For one thing, the parties seem to misunderstand each other's essential natures. Because Republicans view their own party as standing for a stronger America and for smaller government and individual liberty and for traditional social values, they assume that the Democrats are against all of those things. And they often view the Democrats as, for example, intentionally trying to weaken America or interested in big government for its own sake, rather than as the means to an end for some other policy. Conversely, Democrats often view Republicans as simply standing for overprivileged social groups, because Democrats view themselves as standing for underprivileged social groups. And so they often view Republican ideological rhetoric as simply a kind of a window dressing for defending existing privilege and existing social hierarchies. And so the misunderstanding that the parties have of each other is part of what feeds the rancor that we see in American politics today, where nobody is giving a good faith respect to the arguments that the other side is making. They're accusing the other side of being disingenuous, of hiding their true motivations. And that's part of what we see when we see the parties fight each other on the floor of Congress or out on the campaign trail or even in the electorate. We see each party sort of accusing each other of just being not arguing in good faith and not adhering to principles that are worth respecting. And so we think understanding that, in fact, each party is different and is sincerely advancing its own view of politics and what the best politics should be, that is in fact the case. And so if you read our book, I think whichever side you're on, I hope you come away with a little bit more respect for the motivations and the thought processes that animate your political opponents. Another thing I think that the parties could learn from our book and our work on asymmetry is that they each have a unique set of strengths and weaknesses. Rather than having a common set of strengths and weaknesses, because the parties are so different, they each have a different set of problems and a different set of virtues. Republicans, for example, have sort of an advantage of a strong unifying set of beliefs and values that motivates Republicans to participate in elections, to turn out in midterm elections, to sort of view themselves as being part of a common cause. And that's a benefit that the Democrats have often struggled to emulate. Democrats have had a hard time often defining what exactly does their party stand for. Does their party stand for a single set of principles, or is it simply the amalgamated interests of a bunch of different constituent groups? On the other hand, Democrats have had an advantage in accommodating compromise and being able to govern pragmatically, whereas Republicans have often struggled with that. The Republican quest for purity within their own party has often proved very counterproductive when Republicans get into power. And it wasn't that long ago that we saw a Speaker of the House basically deposed by his own party for supposedly not being ideologically pure enough. And that makes it very hard to govern as a Republican leader, because you're constantly being attacked and looking over your shoulder at these fellow Republicans who are accusing you of not being loyal enough to the conservative cause. And that's created a lot of complications on the Republican side. And so if the parties each kind of acquired some of the positive traits of the other, they would probably both be better off, and our American political system would probably be better off. This asymmetry is not necessarily a healthy attribute for us to have, but it's one that seems to be motivating a lot of the problems that we see in our politics today.